The night was heavy with rain, drumming against the forest canopy like 1,000 anxious hearts. James said, "Hold on, I heard it again." His voice cracked with urgency as the faint cry rose through the storm, raw and broken. A metallic snap echoed from deeper in the brush, sharp enough to slice through the roar of water. Sarah said, "That was no branch." Her flashlight beam trembled across slick leaves, shadows twisting with each step. The cries grew louder, a rasping desperation that pulled them forward despite the sucking mud beneath their boots. James muttered, "It's close, too close." Lightning carved the forest open, and for an instant, the shape of the gecko was visible, its body twisted inside a steel snare. The storm swallowed the moment back into darkness. Sarah said, "Oh God, it's trapped." Her voice carried both terror and pity, mixing into the storm's chaos. James pressed forward, branches whipping his soaked jacket, heart pounding. Each cry from the gecko clawed at him, raw survival stripped to its purest sound. He thought of another night long ago, another creature he had failed to reach in time, and his chest tightened with the memory. He whispered, "Not again. Not this time." The forest pressed in, leaves dripping like blood from the storm, every second a reminder that they might already be too late. The cries pierced deeper, sharper, slicing through the rainfall as James stumbled toward the sound. Sarah said, "It's bleeding." Her voice broke. The beam of her light struck the small gecko's leg, torn raw by the trap. James whispered, "Stay calm, little one." His hands shook as he reached for the wire, but mud pulled at his knees, threatening to topple him. The gecko thrashed, desperate, wild eyes rolling back in terror. James muttered, "I can't lose it, not like before." Sarah gripped his shoulder, steadying him. "Breathe, James," she said. "We'll do this together." The rain pounded harder, each drop like nails on steel, as the gecko's rasping cry clawed through the storm. James tugged at the snare, but the steel resisted, slicing deeper into the gecko's skin. Sarah said, "Stop, you'll kill it." Panic swirled in her eyes. James groaned, "We don't have time." He fumbled for his pack, pulling out pliers slick with rain. Lightning split the sky, revealing blood mixing with water. The gecko shrieked, its body convulsing, and James nearly dropped the tool. Sarah whispered, "It's so small, James. It doesn't deserve this." His jaw clenched. "None of them do," he said, and the storm seemed to agree, its thunder rolling like judgment above. The pliers slipped, slicing James' palm. He hissed, but didn't stop. Sarah gasped, "You're bleeding." He snapped, "Doesn't matter." His blood mingled with rain, dripping onto the gecko's skin. The creature froze, eyes wide, breaths shallow. James whispered, "Stay with me." The wire bent but didn't break. His muscles trembled, veins burning with strain. Sarah's hand joined his on the pliers. "Together," she said, and they pulled as the storm howled around them. A faint metallic groan signaled a fracture in the trap. The wire finally snapped, flinging shards into the mud. James staggered back, panting. Sarah caught the gecko gently, cradling it in her trembling hands. "It's breathing," she whispered, relief flooding her face. The gecko's body shuddered, weak but alive, its eyes blinking against the storm. James pressed his wounded hand against his chest, whispering, "Not this time." Lightning lit the clearing, framing them in stark brilliance. For a moment, the storm seemed to pause, as if acknowledging the fragile victory. But the gecko was far from safe, and James knew the real fight had only begun. The storm had slowed to a heavy drizzle, mist curling between the trees as James knelt in the mud, his chest heaving. Sarah whispered, "It's alive, but barely." Her hands trembled as she cupped the gecko against her soaked jacket. James said, "We need to keep it warm." His eyes burned with the echo of failure, memories of past rescues lost too soon clawing at him. The gecko's body shivered, its fragile limbs twitching with pain. Sarah's voice softened. "You've done this before." James shook his head. "And I've lost before," he muttered, bitterness sharp in his throat. He clenched his wounded hand, blood mixing with rainwater. Sarah looked at him, her gaze steady, not pitying but resolute. Then, don't let this one be the same. The forest seemed to hold its breath, quiet now but heavy with unspoken weight. James leaned closer, whispering to the gecko, "You're not leaving us tonight." His words were a promise to himself, as much as to the trembling creature. The light of dawn began to creep through the canopy, golden threads weaving into the fading storm. James pulled off his jacket, wrapping it around Sarah's hands as she held the gecko close. He said, "Its body heat is dropping fast." Sarah looked down at the fragile creature, her eyes glistening. "It's so small, so defenseless." James' voice cracked. "They always are, until someone decides to break them." He glanced at his bleeding palm, the memory of another rescue gone wrong flashing behind his eyes. Sarah whispered, "You carry them with you, don't you? All the ones you couldn't save?" He didn't answer, but the silence spoke louder than words. His jaw tightened, breath heavy. Sarah pressed the gecko gently against her chest. "Then let this one carry you instead," she said, her tone fierce with unexpected strength. James turned toward her, caught between grief and hope. James lifted the gecko gently into his own hands, his breath uneven as if afraid his touch might break it. "You've survived this far," he murmured. "Don't stop now." The gecko's eyes flickered open, black beads glistening with pain. Sarah crouched beside him, her voice low. "It trusts you." James shook his head faintly. "No, it's terrified." His thumb brushed mud from the gecko's scales, trembling with both fear and reverence. He whispered, "I know that fear." Sarah tilted her head. "You're not talking about the gecko." His silence confirmed what she already knew, a past wound still bleeding inside him. Thunder rumbled far in the distance, but softer now, like fading applause. James steadied his breath and said, "I won't fail you, not this time." The gecko blinked, a fragile spark of life refusing to fade. They moved from the clearing to a cluster of dry roots beneath a massive tree, shelter from dripping leaves above. James whispered, "We'll make camp here." Sarah set down her pack, pulling out a cloth and bottle. She said, "Let me clean its wound." James hesitated, his jaw stiff, then nodded. Sarah's hands were gentle but firm as she dabbed away the blood, each touch pulling a faint twitch from the gecko's body. James muttered, "Every second counts." His voice carried urgency but also fear. Sarah said, "And every second we're here, it's still alive." Their eyes met in the half-light, and in that shared silence was a promise neither needed to voice. The gecko's breathing steadied, fragile yet stubborn against the storm's aftermath. For the first time, James let out a breath that wasn't all despair. The rain eased into silence, leaving only the sound of dripping branches. James sat back against the roots, exhaustion etching deep lines into his face. The gecko now lay swaddled in Sarah's jacket, its breaths shallow but steady. Sarah said softly, "It looks better already." James' eyes lingered on the fragile creature, his voice low. "Better isn't safe." He clenched his fists, fighting memories that clawed at him like ghosts. Sarah leaned closer. "You blame yourself for everything, don't you?" He didn't answer, his silence as heavy as the forest around them. The geckos stirred faintly, a weak but living reminder that hope still flickered. James exhaled, long and weary. "If it makes it through tonight," he whispered, "then maybe I can too." Sarah's gaze softened, but she said nothing. The moment hung in the air, fragile as the gecko's breath. The morning brought no peace, only a thicker weight in the air. James crouched by the gecko, his fingers trembling as he checked its wound. Sarah said, "It's not healing, it's worse." Her voice carried the sharp edge of fear. James muttered, "The infection's spreading." He pulled out a small vial from his pack, but the liquid inside was nearly gone. Sarah's eyes widened. "That's all you have?" James snapped. It was supposed to be enough. Frustration cracked through his composure, thunder rumbling faintly beyond the trees. The gecko's chest rose in shallow jerks, its tiny claws twitching. James clenched his jaw. "We need help, real help," Sarah whispered, "but the station's 2 hours away, and the storm took the bridge." James lowered his head, his voice raw. "Then we carry it, or we lose it." The weight of choice pressed heavy, the forest closing in as though it listened to their desperation. They began the trek, James carrying the gecko close to his chest, his hand trembling under its fragile weight. Sarah led the way, boots sinking into wet soil. She said, "The river will be worse after the storm." James tightened his grip, muttering, "We don't have a choice." The forest floor was a battlefield of roots and mud, every step threatening to pull them under. The gecko stirred weakly, its breath rattling. Sarah looked back, her voice shaking. "What if it doesn't make it?" James' eyes flared. "Don't say that." His tone was fierce, but his face betrayed doubt. The sound of rushing water grew louder with every step, an ominous reminder of the barrier ahead. James whispered to the gecko, "Hold on, just hold on." The forest answered only with the relentless roar of the river. The river was a swollen monster, raging with debris and foam. Sarah stopped at the edge, her eyes wide. "It's too strong," she said. James stepped forward, rain still dripping from his hair. "We don't get across, it dies." His voice carried defiance, but his body trembled. The bridge was gone, washed away, only jagged ropes left whipping in the current. Sarah shouted over the roar, "We'll be swept under." James stared at the gecko, its chest fluttering like a dying flame. He whispered, "I won't lose it." Sarah grabbed his arm, desperation in her grip. "Then you'll lose yourself too." The moment hung heavy, torn between fear and determination, the river's rage daring them to try. James tied the gecko's cloth bundle to his chest, pulling the strap tight. Sarah's voice shook. "You'll drown." He met her eyes, fire burning in his. "Then I drown trying." She clenched her fists, fear and fury colliding. The river roared like a living beast, daring them forward. James stepped into the water, its icy grip seizing his legs. Sarah shouted, "James?" He looked back only once, his expression a mix of pain and resolve. "Keep close," he ordered, then waded deeper. The gecko stirred faintly, a fragile reminder of why he risked everything. The current slammed against him, pulling at his legs, but he pressed forward, each step a battle between survival and surrender. The current swallowed them, icy water surging past waist and chest. James fought to keep balance, his muscles screaming. Sarah clung to his side, teeth clenched as she kicked against the torrent. "We won't make it," she cried. James bellowed, "We will." His words were swallowed by the roar. A floating log slammed against them, nearly toppling James. The gecko pressed against his chest, its tiny body trembling with each violent surge. He screamed, "Not again." His memories of failure blurred with the rushing foam. Sarah gritted her teeth, pushing with every ounce of strength. Together they staggered, battered, gasping, until their feet found shallow ground. James collapsed on the opposite bank, clutching the gecko as if it were his last breath. The forest quieted as they reached the ridge, the storm's roar fading into an unsettling silence. James cradled the gecko, its breath still shallow. Sarah caught sight of something glinting on the ground, discarded wire snares, dozens of them. "This wasn't an accident," she whispered, horror in her voice. James' face hardened. "Someone set these traps." His jaw clenched as he picked up a rusted snare, mud dripping from its sharp teeth. The gecko whimpered faintly, as if echoing the cruelty carved into metal. Sarah said, "This is deliberate. Organized." James stared at the line of broken snares stretching into the trees, a cold realization settling into his bones. "We're not fighting nature," he muttered. "We're fighting people." His voice trembled with anger, the memory of past failures crashing back. Sarah placed her hand on his arm, fear and fire mingling in her eyes. "Then they won't stop unless we stop them." The forest seemed to grow darker with the truth revealed. James stared into the tree line, his voice low. "I've seen this before. Sarah turned sharply. What do you mean? He swallowed hard, his eyes dark. Years ago, in another reserve. Same snares, same cruelty. I tried to stop them, but I was too late. His voice cracked under the weight of memory. Sarah asked softly, You lost something then, didn't you? James tightened his grip on the gecko. I lost everything. He looked down at the fragile creature, its body trembling. This species, it was the same. I couldn't save the last one I found. It died in my hands. Sarah's voice broke. And this one, James whispered, this one is my redemption. The wind stirred the trees, carrying with it the ghost of his past failure. For Sarah, the puzzle finally fit. His desperation wasn't just duty, it was penance. A rustle broke the silence. Figures moved in the shadows. Sarah stiffened. We're not alone. James' eyes narrowed, his hand shielding the gecko tighter. Out from the trees, two men appeared, carrying rifles slung casually, their clothes muddy, faces cold. One smirked. Caught yourselves a prize? James rose slowly, his voice sharp. These traps are illegal. The man laughed. Illegal doesn't feed my family. Sarah stepped closer to James, whispering, They're poachers. The second man spat into the mud. That gecko fetches more than you'll earn in a year. James' chest tightened with fury. Over my dead body. Tension crackled in the air like the storm reborn, every heartbeat pounding louder. The poachers grinned, unmoved by his defiance. Maybe that can be arranged, one muttered, stepping forward. James held his ground, his voice steady despite his racing heart. You'll have to kill me before you take it. The lead poacher smirked. That can be arranged. Sarah's voice rang out, fierce and unshaken. It's not just an animal, it's the last of its kind. The men paused, amusement flickering across their faces. That makes it worth more, one sneered. James tightened his grip on the gecko, feeling its faint heartbeat against his chest. You'll never touch it. He shifted his stance, his eyes blazing with defiance. Sarah edged closer, whispering, We can't fight them like this. James muttered, We don't need to fight, we need to outlast. The poachers stepped forward, the forest silent except for the crack of twigs beneath their boots. The world seemed to close in, danger pressing from every side. The poachers circled, eyes hungry, rifles shifting lazily in their hands. James' heart pounded, but his voice was unyielding. This ends here. One poacher sneered, You can't save them all. James said, Maybe not, but I can save this one. Sarah's gaze cut through the tension. And if you kill us, others will come. People who care more than you fear. For a moment, silence hung heavy, the forest watching. The gecko stirred faintly, its fragile body pressing closer against James, as though aware of the storm around it. The poachers exchanged a glance, the greed in their eyes weighed against the conviction in his. One spat and turned away. Not worth the trouble. The other hesitated, then followed. James exhaled, trembling. Sarah whispered, You faced them down. He looked at the gecko, voice hoarse. No, it faced them with me. The truth bound them tighter than before. The forest grew darker, though the sun had risen, heavy clouds pressing down like a weight. James stumbled forward, gecko strapped to his chest, his legs dragging through mud. Sarah said, You can't keep this pace. Her voice was hoarse but firm. James snapped, If I stop, it dies. His words cut sharp, but his body trembled under exhaustion. The gecko stirred faintly, each breath shallow and uneven. Sarah hurried beside him, whispering, Then let me carry it. James shook his head violently. No, this is mine to bear. His jaw locked, his knuckles white around the straps. Thunder rumbled in the distance again, a reminder that the storm was far from gone. James whispered to himself, I won't fail you. His voice broke, but his steps carried him forward into the tightening shadows. They reached a clearing littered with broken branches, the aftermath of the storm. Sarah gasped as she spotted fresh boot prints in the mud. "They're still following us," she hissed. James turned, eyes fierce. "Then we don't stop moving." The gecko whimpered, its tiny claws twitching as if in protest. James' chest tightened, torn between speed and care. Sarah placed a hand on his arm. "If we push too hard, it won't survive." His teeth clenched, torn by the cruel paradox. Behind them, the faint crack of branches carried on the wind, proof that the poachers lingered nearby. James muttered, "They won't take this one." Sarah whispered, "Then we need to outlast them." The weight of the moment pressed heavier than the storm itself, their breaths ragged with dread. A sudden growl tore through the silence. A wild boar emerged from the underbrush, massive and furious, driven by hunger and panic after the storm. Sarah froze, eyes wide. "James." Her voice cracked. James tightened his stance, shielding the gecko instinctively. "Stay behind me." The boar's eyes locked on them, its tusks gleaming with mud and rage. The gecko whimpered, sensing the danger. Sarah clutched James' arm. "We can't fight it," James whispered. "Then we don't fight, we survive." The boar stamped the ground, the forest trembling with its threat. James' pulse hammered, each heartbeat echoing louder than the thunder. He shifted his weight, ready for the charge, knowing one wrong move could end them all. The boar charged, mud spraying in violent bursts. James shoved Sarah aside, his boots sinking as he braced himself. "Run!" he roared. Sarah stumbled but refused to leave. The gecko pressed against his chest, its faint heartbeat like a drum of fate. James leapt sideways as the boar lunged, its tusks slicing empty air. The beast slammed into a tree, bark splintering in a deafening crack. Sarah screamed, "James!" He staggered, mud caking his hands, but he never let the gecko slip from his grip. The boar turned, snorting fury, preparing to strike again. James' lungs burned, every muscle trembling. "Not this time," he hissed through clenched teeth. His eyes blazed with the fire of a man who refused to surrender. The boar lunged again, rage unbroken. James stumbled backward toward a slope, the edge crumbling beneath his boots. Sarah shouted, "James, stop!" but the ground gave way. James fell, rolling down the slope, clutching the gecko desperately to his chest. Rocks tore at his arms, mud streaked his face, but he never let go. At the bottom he slammed into a fallen log, pain exploding through his body. He gasped, chest heaving, as Sarah scrambled down after him. "James!" she cried, sliding to his side. He unwrapped the cloth slightly, his voice broken. "It's alive." "Me?" The gecko blinked weakly, its fragile chest rising. James' eyes filled with tears. "I'll pay any price," he whispered, "but I won't lose you." Above them, the boar's shadow loomed, still hunting. The climax had only sharpened, survival balanced on a knife's edge. The storm passed, leaving the forest drenched in silence. James lay against the fallen log, chest heaving, mud and blood streaking his face. Sarah reached him, breathless, gripping his arm. "You're hurt," she said, voice breaking. James shook his head faintly. "Doesn't matter." His trembling hands loosened a cloth bundle, revealing the gecko stirring weakly. Its chest rose, fragile but steady. Sarah's tears mixed with the mud on her cheeks. "It's alive," she whispered. James' lips curved into the faintest smile, exhaustion pulling him toward collapse. "That's all that matters," he breathed. Around them the forest dripped quietly, the violence of storm and beast fading into memory. The gecko blinked, its dark eyes reflecting dawn's first fragile light. For the first time, hope pressed through the weight of despair. James winced as Sarah wrapped his arm with cloth torn from her jacket. "You'll bleed out if we don't close it soon," she said, her voice steady despite shaking hands. James whispered, "Keep your focus on it, not me." The gecko nestled in his lap, chest rising weakly with each breath. Sarah's eyes softened as she glanced at the tiny creature. "It's stronger than I thought," she murmured. James managed a faint chuckle. "Stronger than both of us." He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the faint drip of water from the trees, each drop a reminder that life clings on even after chaos. It survived the storm, the trap, even us, he said softly. Sarah pressed the cloth tighter, whispering, then maybe it's meant to live. For once, James didn't argue. He just held the gecko closer. They found a hollow beneath an ancient tree, shelter from the dripping branches. James leaned back against the roots, cradling the gecko in cupped hands. Sarah lit a small flame from soaked kindling, coaxing it until smoke curled. It won't last long, she said, voice cautious. James replied, it only needs to last long enough. The warmth spread faintly, and the gecko stirred, its scales glistening in the dim glow. Sarah leaned close, her expression tender. Look at it. It's fighting. James' throat tightened. It's doing what I couldn't, years ago. He stroked the gecko gently, careful not to hurt its wound. This one won't die for my mistakes. Sarah watched him silently, seeing the cracks in his armor soften into something raw, something human. The gecko's breathing steadied under the warmth, though its movements remained weak. James' eyes never left it, every twitch a lifeline. Sarah sat beside him, exhaustion softening her features. Why this one, James? She asked quietly. He swallowed hard. Because once I failed. It died in my hands and I couldn't forget. His voice cracked. This isn't just a rescue. It's a promise. Sarah placed her hand gently on his shoulder. You've kept it. He shook his head, staring at the fragile creature. Not yet, not until it's free again. The silence between them carried more weight than words. Sarah leaned closer, whispering, then we'll get it there, together. James' jaw tightened. But for the first time, his eyes glistened with something more than pain. The night deepened, stars flickering faintly beyond the canopy. James sat awake, the gecko in his hands, watching each fragile breath. Sarah leaned against the tree beside him, finally asleep, her exhaustion overwhelming. James whispered to the gecko, I couldn't save the last one, but I'll save you. His voice cracked, filled with both fear and hope. The gecko blinked slowly, as though answering him. James exhaled, a tremor leaving his body. He lifted his gaze toward the stars. For every life I lost, maybe this one makes it matter, he said softly. The forest was silent, the storm a distant memory, the world holding still in fragile peace. For a fleeting moment, James allowed himself to believe in redemption. The forest awoke with morning light, birds calling softly above the dripping canopy. James held the gecko carefully, its body steadier, breaths no longer ragged but rhythmic. Sarah touched his shoulder, her eyes filled with quiet relief. Ill fighting, she whispered. James nodded, his lips trembling into a faint smile. So am I. He looked out into the trees, the storm's destruction still visible, branches broken and soil torn. Yet, life persisted, green shoots pressing through mud. James whispered to the gecko, you were never meant to die here. Sarah exhaled, the weight of their journey hanging between them. Then let's take it where it belongs. James' gaze lifted to the horizon where faint light spilled through the leaves. The end of one storm had revealed the beginning of something fragile and new. They reached a small rise overlooking the valley, where sunlight stretched across endless green. James carried the gecko close, his eyes fixed on the view. Sarah stood beside him whispering, this is where it belongs. James' voice cracked. A place without cages, without traps? The gecko stirred, blinking as though sensing freedom beyond. James exhaled, his chest loosening for the first time in days. This is its world, not ours. Sarah nodded, her gaze steady. And it will remember that you fought for it. The words hit deep, breaking through the walls James had carried. He whispered, or maybe I'll remember. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet earth and dawn, wrapping around them like the voice of the forest itself. James knelt in the grass, setting the gecko gently on a moss-covered stone warmed by the sun. Sarah crouched beside him, her hands clasped together, silent as though in prayer. The gecko blinked slowly, testing its limbs, its tiny claws gripping the stone. James whispered, you're free now. his throat tightened, eyes glistening. The gecko stretched its fragile body, scales glowing in the light, then paused, looking back at him. For a heartbeat, James felt seen, his guilt, his struggle, all reflected in the creature's black eyes. Sarah whispered, "It knows." James smiled faintly, whispering back, "So do I." The forest seemed to bow in stillness, honoring the fragile moment of release. A promise kept at last. The gecko began to move, step by fragile step, its body trembling but determined. James' breath caught as he leaned forward, every muscle straining with fear and hope. Sarah whispered, "It's choosing life." The gecko paused at the edge of the stone, then crawled into the tall grass, its mottled body disappearing into green. James whispered, "Go on." His voice cracked but carried strength. The sound of rustling leaves marked its passage, each movement pulling it farther from their hands, closer to its world. James closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek. Sarah placed her hand in his, squeezing gently. The silence left behind was heavy but full, carrying the weight of both loss and triumph. For the first time, James felt the burden lift. The clearing grew still, the forest alive again with distant bird calls. James sat back, his empty hands trembling. He whispered, "It's gone." Sarah rested her head against his shoulder, her voice tender. "No, it's free." James lifted his gaze toward the canopy, sunlight breaking into shards of brilliance through the leaves. His breath slowed, the ache in his chest finally loosening. "Not again," he whispered, voice steady, "not this time." The forest answered with silence, but the silence carried meaning. The gecko's absence was not a wound, but a promise fulfilled. James closed his eyes, holding the memory like a heartbeat. Sarah's hand remained in his, grounding him in the present. Together they sat, the world around them alive, the final moment etched into their souls forever.